The coffee cup trembled against the saucer as Sarah Martinez set it down on table 12, her hands still shaking from the conversation she had overheard at the corner booth. The morning rush at Rosie's diner was in full swing, the familiar symphony of clinking silverware and sizzling bacon filling the air. But something about the man in the expensive suit speaking quietly into his phone had made her pause behind the counter. His words cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. Emma and Ethan will never see again. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable, raw and unfiltered in a way that money couldn't mask. If you've ever felt helpless watching someone you love suffer, you understand why some stories demand to be shared. So stay with us because what happens next will restore your faith in the power of human connection. Sarah had been working at the diner for 3 years, ever since her own world had shifted on its axis. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor, highlighting every scuff mark and stain that told the story of countless meals served and lives intersected within these walls. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her uniform bearing the faint aroma of coffee and bacon that had become as familiar as her own skin. But today felt different, charged with an energy she couldn't quite name, as if the universe was preparing to reveal one of its carefully guarded secrets. The man at the corner booth was Richard Blackwood, though Sarah didn't know his name yet. His tailored charcoal suit and platinum watch spoke of wealth that most people could only imagine, but his posture told a different story entirely. His shoulders curved inward as if carrying an invisible weight, and his fingers drummed against the table in a nervous rhythm that betrayed the composure his appearance suggested. He had come to the diner not for the food, which was decent but unremarkable, but because it was the only place in the city where he could sit anonymously and process the devastating news he had received just hours earlier. Richard's twins, Emma and Ethan, had been born with a rare genetic condition that had gradually stolen their sight over the course of their 8 years of life. He had spent millions consulting with specialists around the world, funding experimental treatments, and exploring every possible avenue that money could open. The irony wasn't lost on him that his vast fortune, built through decades of calculated risks and strategic investments, was powerless against the microscopic defect in his children's DNA that had condemned them to a world of darkness. Sarah approached his table with the coffee pot, noting the way his jaw clenched as he ended his phone call. There was something about his expression that reminded her of her own reflection in the months after her accident, when she had learned that her dreams of becoming a pediatric surgeon would never materialize due to the nerve damage in her hands. The tremor that now made her unsuitable for surgery had initially felt like the end of everything she had worked toward, but time had taught her that sometimes the paths we don't choose lead to destinations we never could have imagined. "More coffee?" she asked, her voice gentle in the way that comes from understanding pain intimately. Richard looked up, and for a moment, his carefully constructed facade cracked just enough to reveal the father beneath the businessman. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse from the emotional phone calls that had consumed his morning. As Sarah poured the coffee, he found himself studying her face, noting the kindness in her eyes and the steadiness of her movements, despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Rough morning?" Sarah asked, setting the pot down and lingering beside his table. Something about his demeanor reminded her of the parents she had encountered during her medical school rotations, the ones who sat in hospital waiting rooms with that particular blend of hope and desperation that comes with loving someone whose fate lies beyond your control. Richard hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing personal details with strangers, but something about Sarah's presence invited honesty. "My children," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of his entire world. "They're losing their sight, and I can't fix it." Sarah felt her heart constrict with recognition. She had seen that look before, in the mirror and in the faces of countless families she had encountered during her brief medical career. Without thinking, she slid into the seat across from him, her break not officially starting for another hour, but sensing that this moment required her full attention. "How old are they?" she asked. 8, Richard replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Twins, Emma and Ethan. They were born with Leber congenital amaurosis, and their vision has been deteriorating since they were toddlers. The specialists say they'll be completely blind within the year, and there's no treatment available." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that condition, had studied it extensively during her ophthalmology rotation, but more importantly, she knew something that Richard's expensive specialists apparently didn't. "Have you heard of gene therapy trials for LCA?" she asked carefully, her medical training surfacing despite the years that had passed since she had last worn scrubs. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on her with laser intensity. "What do you know about gene therapy?" Sarah felt the familiar ache of her abandoned dreams, but for the first time in years, it was accompanied by something else: purpose. "I was in medical school before my accident," she said, flexing her fingers unconsciously. "I specialized in pediatric ophthalmology for 2 years before nerve damage ended my surgical career. But I remember reading about experimental treatments for LCA, trials that were showing promising results in children. The conversation that followed would change both of their lives in ways neither could have anticipated." Sarah explained what she remembered about the gene therapy research, how scientists had been working to replace the defective genes responsible for LCA with healthy copies delivered directly to the retina. The treatment was still experimental, available only through clinical trials, but the early results had been remarkable. Children who had been legally blind were regaining functional vision, seeing their parents' faces for the first time in years. Richard listened with the intensity of a man grasping at his last hope, asking detailed questions that Sarah answered with the precision of someone whose medical knowledge had been hard-earned and never forgotten. As she spoke, he began to understand that this waitress possessed expertise that his team of high-priced consultants had somehow overlooked. The irony was staggering. The information that could save his children's sight had come not from a prestigious medical center, but from a diner booth conversation with a woman whose own dreams had been derailed by circumstances beyond her control. "Why didn't any of the specialists mention this?" Richard asked, his voice tight with a mixture of hope and anger. Sarah chose her words carefully, understanding the delicate balance between offering hope and managing expectations. Gene therapy is still considered experimental by many practitioners. Some doctors are conservative about recommending treatments that aren't yet standard care, especially when they're dealing with wealthy patients who might sue if things go wrong. But the research is solid, and the trials are real. Richard pulled out his phone and began making calls immediately, his businessman's instincts taking over as he mobilized his resources to investigate every lead Sarah had provided. But as he spoke with research coordinators and clinical trial administrators, he kept glancing back at the woman across from him, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought them together. Here was someone who had lost her own medical career, but was using her knowledge to potentially save his children's sight. Over the following days, Richard found himself returning to the diner, not just for updates on his children's case, but for conversations with Sarah that ranged far beyond medical topics. He learned about her journey from promising medical student to diner waitress, about the car accident that had damaged the nerves in her hands and ended her surgical aspirations, and about the depression that had followed as she watched her classmates graduate and begin the careers she had dreamed of since childhood. Sarah, in turn, learned about Richard's guilt over his children's condition, his desperate need to fix everything with money and influence, and his growing realization that some of life's most important solutions couldn't be purchased. She watched him struggle with the helplessness that came with loving someone whose suffering you couldn't simply write a check to eliminate, and she recognized the transformation that such vulnerability could bring. The gene therapy trial that Sarah had identified was being conducted at a research hospital 3 states away, and the waiting list was extensive. But Richard's resources, combined with Sarah's medical knowledge and advocacy, created a powerful combination. She helped him understand the technical aspects of the treatment, the realistic timelines for results, and the emotional preparation that Emma and Ethan would need for the process. What struck Richard most profoundly was Sarah's insistence on being involved not as a paid consultant, but as someone who genuinely cared about his children's outcome. When he offered to compensate her for her time and expertise, she declined, explaining that some things couldn't be reduced to financial transactions. "This isn't about money," she said during one of their conversations. "Tao. It's about using what I know to help kids who need it. That's what I always wanted to do, even if it's not happening the way I originally planned." The day Richard brought Emma and Ethan to meet Sarah at the diner was a turning point for all of them. The twins navigated the space with the confidence of children who had learned to trust their other senses, their hands trailing along table edges and their heads tilted to catch every sound. Sarah watched them with the trained eye of someone who understood both their medical condition and their remarkable adaptability, marveling at their resilience and the obvious love that bound them to their father. "Dad says you're going to help us see again," Emma said as Sarah knelt beside their booth, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance that children often bring to extraordinary circumstances. "I'm going to try to help the doctors who can do that," Sarah replied, touched by the child's directness. "But even if the treatment works, it will take time and you'll need to be very brave." Ethan, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Are you a doctor?" he asked, his head tilted in Sarah's direction. Sarah felt the familiar pang of loss, but it was softer now, tempered by the purpose she had found in this unexpected situation. "I studied to be one," she said honestly, "but sometimes life takes us in different directions than we planned." What happened next would stay with Richard for the rest of his life. Emma reached out and found Sarah's hand, her small fingers tracing the slight tremor that had ended Sarah's surgical career. "Your hands shake like mine do when I'm nervous," she said with the innocent wisdom that children sometimes possess. "But they still work, right? They can still help people." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that this 8-year-old girl had just articulated something she had been struggling to understand for years. Her hands might not be steady enough for surgery, but they could still comfort, still guide, still make a difference in ways she had never considered. "Yes," she said softly, "they can still help people." The process of getting Emma and Ethan into the gene therapy trial was complex and emotionally demanding, requiring extensive medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and legal documentation. Sarah found herself serving as an interpreter between the medical team and the family, translating complex procedures into language that made sense to parents facing an impossible decision. Her medical background allowed her to ask the right questions and understand the nuanced answers, while her experience with loss helped her prepare Richard for the emotional challenges ahead. But the real test came when they learned that the trial had specific criteria that Emma and Ethan might not meet. Their particular genetic variant was slightly different from the ones that had shown the most success in previous studies, and there was debate among the researchers about whether the treatment would be effective. The lead investigator, Dr. Patricia Chen, was cautious about raising false hopes, while other team members argued that the potential benefits outweighed the risks. Richard found himself in the familiar position of trying to use his influence to secure his children's admission to the trial, but Sarah counseled a different approach. "And this isn't about pulling strings," she told him during one of their increasingly frequent phone conversations. "It's about making sure Emma and Ethan are truly good candidates for the treatment. We need to trust the science, even if it's not what we want to hear." The conversation that followed forced Richard to confront his deepest fears about his children's future and his own limitations as a father. Sarah listened as he voiced his terror of watching Emma and Ethan navigate a world that wasn't designed for blind children, his guilt over the genetic lottery that had affected them, and his desperate need to believe that money and determination could overcome any obstacle. "I've spent my entire career solving problems," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've built companies, moved markets, influenced legislation, but I can't fix this, and it's killing me." Sarah understood that feeling intimately, having faced her own moment of reckoning when she realized that all her years of study and preparation couldn't overcome the damage to her nervous system. "Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is admit we're not in control," she said gently. "That doesn't make us failures. It makes us human." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Chen, who had been reviewing Emma and Ethan's case files, noticed something in their medical history that previous specialists had overlooked. Their particular genetic variant, while different from the standard LCA mutations, was actually similar to one that had shown remarkable success in a European trial. The treatment protocol would need to be modified slightly, but the fundamental approach remained sound. More importantly, Dr. Chen was impressed by the family's preparation and understanding of the treatment process, particularly the sophisticated questions that came from Sarah's medical background. "It's rare to work with families who understand both the science and the emotional complexity of what we're doing," she told Richard during their consultation. "Having someone with medical training as an advocate for your children could actually improve their outcomes." The decision to proceed with the treatment was ultimately made by Emma and Ethan themselves, with guidance from their father and Sarah. The twins, despite their young age, demonstrated a maturity that came from years of adapting to their changing vision. They asked thoughtful questions about the procedure, the recovery process, and the possibility that the treatment might not work. Their courage in the face of uncertainty humbled both adults and reinforced Sarah's belief that children often possess wisdom that adults spend years trying to rediscover. The gene therapy procedure itself was performed over several sessions, with microscopic injections delivered directly to the twins' retinas. Sarah remained in close contact with the family throughout the process, providing emotional support and helping to interpret the medical updates that came from the research team. The immediate results were subtle, with gradual improvements in light perception and contrast sensitivity that built slowly over weeks and months. But the moment that changed everything came 3 months after the final treatment session. Emma, who had been playing in the hospital's family room, suddenly stopped and stared at the window. "Dad," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I can see the tree outside. I can see the leaves moving." Richard felt his knees buckle as he realized what was happening. Ethan, who had been sitting nearby, turned toward his sister's voice and gasped. "The walls," he whispered. "They're not just dark anymore. I can see where they end." The medical team confirmed what the family already knew. The gene therapy was working. Emma and Ethan's vision was returning gradually, with improvements that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Their brains, which had been adapting to blindness for years, now had to relearn how to process visual information, creating a unique rehabilitation challenge that required patience and specialized therapy. Sarah was there for every milestone, from the first time Emma saw her father's face clearly to the moment Ethan successfully navigated an obstacle course using only his vision. She watched as the twins discovered colors they had never seen, marveled at their own reflections, and experienced the joy of reading printed words instead of relying solely on Braille. But perhaps the most profound change was in Richard himself. The experience of nearly losing his children's sight and then witnessing its restoration through the kindness and knowledge of someone he had met by chance had fundamentally altered his perspective on wealth, power, and purpose. He began to understand that his greatest privilege wasn't his money, but his ability to use it in service of something larger than himself. The partnership between Richard and Sarah evolved into something neither had anticipated. He established a foundation dedicated to funding gene therapy research and ensuring that experimental treatments were accessible to families regardless of their financial circumstances. Sarah became the foundation's medical director, using her knowledge and experience to identify promising research and advocate for patients who might otherwise be overlooked by the medical establishment. Their collaboration attracted attention from researchers around the world, creating a network of scientists, clinicians, and advocates working to bring cutting-edge treatments to children with rare genetic conditions. The Foundation's approach, which combined rigorous scientific evaluation with compassionate patient advocacy, became a model for how medical philanthropy could create meaningful change. What would you have done if you encountered someone whose expertise could save a child's sight, but whose own dreams had been shattered by circumstances beyond their control? Sometimes the most important question isn't whether we deserve help, but whether we're wise enough to recognize it when it comes from unexpected sources. Emma and Ethan's recovery continued to exceed expectations, with their vision stabilizing at levels that allowed them to attend regular school, participate in sports, and pursue interests that had been impossible during their years of progressive blindness. They became advocates themselves, speaking at medical conferences and sharing their story with other families facing similar challenges. Their resilience and optimism inspired everyone who met them, proving that hope could survive even the darkest circumstances. Sarah found herself traveling frequently for the foundation, consulting on cases around the world and helping to establish treatment centers in underserved communities. The work was demanding but deeply fulfilling, allowing her to use her medical knowledge in ways she had never imagined when she first entered medical school. Her hands still trembled, but they had found new purpose in holding the hands of frightened parents and guiding families through complex medical decisions. The foundation's success attracted the attention of major pharmaceutical companies and government agencies, leading to partnerships that accelerated research and expanded access to experimental treatments. Richard's business acumen, while combined with Sarah's medical expertise and genuine compassion, created a powerful force for change in the field of rare disease research. Years later, when Richard was invited to speak at a medical conference about the Foundation's work, he began his presentation with a simple statement. "The most important medical consultation of my life happened in a diner booth, delivered by a waitress whose own dreams had been interrupted by tragedy." He told the audience about meeting Sarah, about her willingness to share her knowledge despite her own losses, and about the ripple effects that had followed from that chance encounter. The audience, filled with researchers, clinicians, and patient advocates, listened as Richard described the evolution of their partnership and its impact on hundreds of families around the world. But the most powerful moment came when he introduced Emma and Ethan, now teenagers who spoke eloquently about their experience and their commitment to ensuring that other children had access to the treatments that had restored their sight. "We learned that healing doesn't always come from the places you expect," Emma told the audience, her clear vision allowing her to make eye contact with listeners throughout the auditorium. "Sometimes it comes from people who understand loss and choose to transform it into hope for others." As the conference ended and attendees approached the family with questions and collaboration proposals, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The tremor in her hands had never disappeared, but it had become a reminder of how unexpected paths could lead to extraordinary destinations. Her surgical career had ended, but her ability to heal had found new expression through advocacy, education, and the simple act of caring about the welfare of children she might never meet. The foundation continued to grow, funding research into dozens of rare genetic conditions and establishing treatment centers on every continent. Richard and Sarah's partnership had proven that meaningful change required both resources and expertise, both vision and compassion. Their work had saved the sight of hundreds of children and given hope to thousands of families who had been told that nothing could be done. Emma and Ethan, now young adults, had both chosen careers in medicine, inspired by their own experience and the example set by Sarah and their father. They worked closely with the foundation, bringing the perspective of patients who had lived through experimental treatment and emerged with both restored vision and deep empathy for others facing similar challenges. The story of their family had become larger than any of them, inspiring a movement that recognized patient advocacy as essential to medical progress. Their collaboration had proven that the most powerful healing often happened when people with different kinds of knowledge and experience chose to work together as equals, united by their commitment to reducing suffering and expanding hope. If this story has reminded you that our greatest challenges can become our most meaningful contributions, consider sharing it with someone who might need that perspective today. Sometimes the most profound healing happens not when we overcome our limitations, but when we discover how to use them in service of others. Like and subscribe if you believe that every setback contains the seeds of a comeback, and that the most important medical breakthroughs often begin with simple human kindness expressed at exactly the right moment.